Every day, a young black girl named Natasha waved at Officer Charlie as he passed by on his patrol. However, one morning, when she wasn't where she usually was, he felt really scared. When Charlie rushed to her house, he was met with the devastating truth that made him cry. What terrible truth did he find that made everything different? Let us know where in the world you are watching from below before we start the story. Don't forget to subscribe if you like this story. Officer Charlie Blake strode onto the sidewalk, his polished sneakers tapping steadily as he began his regular patrol. The sharp morning air cut at his cheeks, but he scarcely noticed because his gaze was locked on the familiar corner ahead. His heartbeat quickened as he approached. She arrived exactly on schedule. Natasha, 4 years old, stood outside her window, waving cheerfully. Charlie's expression softened into a pleasant smile, and he lifted his hand in response. This brief chat had become the highlight of Charlie's day. In a job that frequently left him feeling isolated, this moment of connection meant more than he could convey. "Morning, Natasha," he said to himself, barely above a whisper. Charlie slowed his pace as he passed the house, enjoying the moment. Natasha's wide brown eyes twinkled with delight, and her gap-toothed grin remained as bright as ever. But today, Charlie observed something unusual. The tiny girl was paler than usual, with dark circles around her eyes. Charlie felt a flutter of worry in his heart. He brushed it off, telling himself he was imagining things. Kids are tired occasionally, right? It was probably nothing. As Charlie went down the street, his thoughts returned to Natasha. He remembered the first time he saw her at that window, barely tall enough to see over the sill. She was now a large girl of 7, yet her wave had not changed at all. Charlie's own youth had not been full of such modest pleasures. His family life had been difficult, leaving him with scars that still hurt. Perhaps that is why Natasha's daily greeting was so important to him. It served as a reminder that the world was capable of kindness, even in small ways. The officer's radio crackled, bringing him back to the present. He answered the phone, but his thoughts were still on the little girl at the window. Charlie had no idea how much his presence meant to Natasha, or what battles she was fighting quietly behind that happy wave. As he crossed the corner and left Natasha's house behind, Charlie made a quiet commitment. Tomorrow, he'd wave a little longer and smile a little brighter. Because often the tiniest gestures can make the greatest impact. Charlie continued his patrol, his thoughts still focused on Natasha's wave. As he wandered, immersed in thought, the neighborhood's familiar streets blurred together. He'd been a police officer for nearly 2 decades, and while he was proud of his work, it frequently left him feeling alienated. The grueling hours, unexpected shifts, and emotional toll of the job had gradually eroded his personal life. Charlie had reached middle age and found himself alone. No wife, no children, there's no family to speak of. His own parents and siblings were distant memories, their ties shattered by years of miscommunication and unspoken hurt. Charlie had learned to cope with his loneliness, but it didn't make things any easier. As Charlie turned another curve, his thoughts returned to Natasha. He realized how little he knew about her and her family. Was there a father in the picture? Did she have siblings? He'd never noticed anyone else in that window, just the little girl with the wide smile. Despite knowing so little, Charlie felt a strong connection with Natasha. Their everyday interchange had developed into more than just a wave. It was a brief burst of happiness in his otherwise isolated day. Charlie examined his watch and noted the time. In a few hours, he'd return to this street, where Natasha would be waiting to wave. The concept made him grin, and it warmed him from within. It was amusing, Charlie thought, how such a simple act could mean so much. That small wave had become the highlight of his dia moment, of pure, straightforward joy in a world that was often chilly and unsympathetic. As he continued his patrol, Charlie found himself looking forward to tomorrow's wave with an unexpected anticipation. It wasn't just a nice gesture anymore. It served as a reminder that he was not utterly alone in the world, that someone, even a child he barely knew, observed and acknowledged him on a daily basis. Charlie's radio crackled again, bringing him back into the present. He answered the phone, his voice firm and professional. But even as he focused on his responsibilities, a part of him clutched onto Natasha's wave, carrying it with him like a shield against the loneliness of his days. The next morning dawned bright and clear, but Charlie's heart was sad. As he approached the familiar corner, his gaze shifted to the window where Natasha always stood. Today, however, the spot was empty, with no cheerful face or tiny hand waving hello. Charlie's steps faltered, sending a shiver down his spine. He attempted to shake off the sense of dread that had rushed over him. Maybe Natasha was simply running late, he reasoned. Maybe she wasn't feeling well, but something in his gut warned him that this was wrong. The absence of that modest daily habit created a cavernous vacuum in his morning. Charlie pulled up to the curb without thinking. He stood for a minute, gazing at the motionless house. The curtains were drawn, and the entire space appeared unnaturally still. He took a deep breath and walked up the walkway to the front door. His hand paused for a second before knocking. The boom seemed too loud in the still morning air. Charlie waited, his heart thumping against his chest. He was going to knock again when he heard footsteps coming from within. The door slowly opened to reveal a woman he had never seen before. Her eyes were red and puffy, and her expression was filled with dread. This must be Natasha's mother, he concluded. "Hello, ma'am," Charlie murmured softly. "I am Officer Blake." Natasha generally waves from the window in the mornings. "I became concerned when she didn't show up today. Is everything all right?" When the mother heard Natasha's name, her face fell. She attempted to speak, but a sob caught in her throat. Charlie felt his heart fall even more. "I'm Glory, Natasha's mother," she managed to mumble, just above a whisper. "Natasha, she's not doing well. We had to take her to the hospital last night." Charlie felt as if the ground had slid out from under him. He knew Natasha was important to him, but he had no idea how much until this moment. "I'm so sorry," he murmured, his voice filled with sorrow. "Is there anything I can do to help?" Glory shook her head, tears falling down her cheeks. "Thank you, but we're just waiting. The doctors are doing tests." Charlie nodded, feeling powerless. He wanted to do more, say more, but he wasn't sure how. "If you want anything at all, please do not hesitate to contact the station. Ask for Officer Blake." Glory nodded and managed a wan smile. "Thank you." Natasha always looked forward to waving to you. It meant a lot to her. Charlie felt a lump forming in his throat. "It meant a lot to me too," he added softly. Glory took a long breath, attempting to stabilize herself. Her hands trembled as she grabbed the doorframe for support. Charlie waited there, heart heavy with worry, waiting for her to speak. "Natasha," Glory said, barely above a whisper, "has been sick for a time now. We didn't inform anyone. We believed we could handle it on our own." Charlie felt a lump forming in his throat. He wanted to reach out and offer comfort, but he was unclear what to do. Glory continued, her words coming out quickly. "Aplastic anemia is a rare condition, according to doctors. Her body is not producing enough blood cells." Her voice broke at the last syllable, and she covered her lips with her hand, trying to hold back a sob. Charlie's mind whirled. Every morning, he thought about Natasha's brilliant grin and small hand waving at him. How could someone so full of life be ill? He felt a tremendous hurt in his chest, a combination of shock and despair. "Life-threatening," Glory said quietly, the words hanging thick in the air between them. "That is what they told us. If we cannot find a match for a bone marrow transplant." She couldn't complete the phrase. Tears flowed down her cheeks, and her shoulders shook with silent sobbing. Charlie remained there, transfixed, the entire weight of the situation bearing down on him. He had no words of comfort to offer in the face of such dreadful news. While he was happy by Natasha's simple act, the little girl and her mother were fighting a silent battle. Charlie felt a flood of remorse sweep over him. He should have known. He should have realized that something was wrong. Charlie eventually managed to utter, "I'm so sorry," his voice filled with anguish. "I had no idea. Is there anything I can do?" Glory shook her head and wiped away her tears with the back of her hand. "You've already accomplished so much, Officer Blake. Natasha truly appreciated your daily waves. She looked forward to it and felt normal." Charlie felt his own eyes start to water. He blinked quickly, trying to keep his composure, but within, he felt lost and helpless in the face of this tragic truth. Then, as Glory's words set in, Charlie felt a surge of determination rush over him. He couldn't simply stand by and do nothing. Charlie took a big breath and looked at Glory with determination in his eyes. "Glory, I know we don't know each other well, but I'd like to help. Whatever you need, ride to the hospital, someone to talk to, or anything else, I'm here for you and Natasha," he replied, his voice firm and genuine. Glory's eyes welled up with new tears, but this time, there was a glimmer of appreciation. "Thank you, Officer Blake. That means more than you realize." Charlie nodded, his mind already spinning with ideas for how he might help this needy family. "I'll stop by the hospital this evening to check on Natasha, if that's okay with you." Glory attempted a slight smile. She'd like it. She usually mentions the kind police guy who waved at her. Later that evening, Charlie found himself going down the sterile corridors of the children's unit. The odor of disinfection filled his nostrils, and the beeping of equipment resonated in his ears. His heart raced as he neared Natasha's room. Nothing could have prepared him for the scene that awaited him. Natasha, the colorful little girl who had always enlivened his mornings, lay pale and little in the hospital bed. Tubes and wires joined her to numerous machines that blinked and buzzed around her. Charlie's breath seized in his throat. He had seen many difficult things throughout his years as a police officer, but this was different. This was personal. As Natasha approached the room, his eyes fluttered open. Despite her weakened position, she smiled slightly. "Officer Charlie," she said quietly, her voice scarcely audible. Charlie proceeded to her bedside, taking care not to disturb any of the apparatus. "Hey there, Natasha," he replied quietly, attempting to maintain his voice. "I missed your wave this morning." Natasha smiled a little wider. "I apologize. I did not mean to worry you." Charlie felt his heart contract. Here was this brave little child, apologizing to him while struggling for her survival. He softly grasped her little hand in his. "Don't worry about it, just focus on getting better, okay?" Charlie, amazed as he sat there, holding Natasha's hand, and conversing softly with her and Glory about how deeply this child had touched his life. He had always looked forward to her waves, but he had no idea how much they meant to him until recently. Charlie made a secret pledge to Glory and Natasha, looking at their worn faces and brave smiles, that he would be with them every step of the journey. He would ensure that they had all they needed. "I'll be back tomorrow," Charlie stated as he prepared to leave. "The day after that, and the day after that. You are not alone in this, okay?" Charlie began to make regular trips to Natasha's hospital room. He'd swing by after his shift, occasionally bringing modest gifts like coloring books or cuddly animals. The sterile hospital room gradually evolved, filled with sketches and cheery decor. Charlie arrived one evening to discover Glory sitting alone at Natasha's bedside. The tiny girl slept soundly, her chest rising and falling evenly. Glory looked up as Charlie walked in, smiling tiredly. "How's she doing today?" Charlie asked softly, sinking into the chair next to Glory. Glory sighed, her gaze never leaving her daughter's face. "She had a good day." The doctors remained cautiously optimistic. Charlie nodded as relief washed over him. They sat in pleasant stillness for a while, the only sounds being the calm beeping of devices and Natasha's soft breathing. After a few moments, Glory looked to Charlie, her eyes filled with unshed tears. "You know, Officer Blocka Charlie never told you why Natasha started waving to you every morning. Charlie leaned closer, his curiosity piqued. I always wondered about that, he said. Glory took a long breath before speaking, her voice faltering slightly. 3 years ago, Natasha's father, my husband, passed away. Before that, every morning, he'd wave goodbye to Natasha as he drove away for work. Charlie felt a lump rise in his throat as Glory spoke. After his death, Natasha was devastated. Every morning, she'd stand by the window, waiting for a wave that never came. Glory paused and wiped a tear from her cheek. Then one day, she noticed you driving by in your patrol car. You reminded her of her father in his uniform. Charlie's heart ached as he realized the importance of Natasha's daily practice. She started waving to you because it made her feel closer to her father again. Glory remarked, her voice full with passion. It became her way of honoring his memory and keeping that connection alive. Charlie sat back, shocked by the revelation. He had always assumed Natasha's wave was a kind gesture from a sweet little kid. He had no idea it had such significant meaning for her. I had no idea, Charlie murmured, barely above a whisper. Thanks for informing me, Glory. It means so much to know that. Glory reached out to squeeze Charlie's hand. Thank you for being there for her and us. You've become such an integral part of our lives. Charlie had a fresh feeling of purpose after seeing Natasha's sleeping figure. He was more than simply a kind face to her. He was a link to her father, a source of comfort and stability in her young life. The weight of this revelation fell on his shoulders. Not as a hardship, but as an invaluable obligation. Charlie sat in silence for a time to comprehend Glory's comments. The significance of Natasha's daily wave overwhelmed his heart with emotions he couldn't put into words. When he gazed at the sleeping youngster, her petite figure dwarfed by the hospital bed, a surge of protectiveness washed over him. Glory, he continued softly, turning to face her. I want you to know that I'm here for you both, not just as a police officer, but also as a friend. Is there something I can do to help? Glory's eyes filled up with tears. Oh, Charlie, she said softly, her voice cracking. You have already accomplished so much. Just being here means everything to us. Charlie shook his head, determination settling in. I want to accomplish more. Please allow me to assist you with any errands or other needs. You shouldn't have to deal with this alone. Over the next 4 weeks, Charlie became a constant in their life. He visited the hospital every day, occasionally bringing groceries for Glory or new coloring books for Natasha. On days when Glory appeared particularly fatigued, he recommended she return home for a few hours of rest, pledging to stay with Natasha. Charlie would sit at Natasha's bedside and read her books or simply talk to her in a calm voice. He told her about his day on patrol and the humorous things he'd observed, always keeping his tone light and upbeat. Natasha wakened in her sleep one afternoon, as Charlie was assisting Glory in sorting through a stack of medical bills. Daddy, she muttered, her eyes flickering open. Charlie and Glory exchanged looks, their hearts aching slightly. Charlie walked to Natasha's side and softly took her hand. Hey there, sweetheart, he murmured quietly. It's Charles. Your mom is also here. Natasha blinked, concentrating on Charlie's expression. A little smile appeared on her lips. Officer Charlie, she said, her voice soft yet cheerful. You're here. Charlie felt his throat tighten with emotion. Of course, I'm here, youngster. I would not miss our daily wave for anything. Natasha's smile became bigger. Can we wave now? She asked, raising her hand slightly. Charlie nodded with tearful eyes. You bet we can. Charlie felt something move inside him as they exchanged waves. It wasn't just about keeping a commitment or performing a good deed. Natasha and Glory had become family to him, filling a hole he hadn't realized existed. Charlie stood in the hallway outside Natasha's room, his mind racing. The doctor's words rang in his ears, each phrase a hammer strike to his heart. Natasha's condition deteriorated faster than expected. The outlook was gloomy. He leaned against the wall, his legs suddenly weakening. He could see Glory sitting beside Natasha's bedside, her shoulders quivering with quiet sobbing through the door's small glass. Charlie's chest squeezed, and a lump developed in his throat. Unable to endure the sight any longer, he pushed himself off the wall and began walking. His feet led him aimlessly through the sterile hospital corridors, his head swirling with emotions. Nurses and physicians rushed by him, but Charlie hardly saw them. He felt as if he were moving through a cloud, with everything around him muffled and distant. As he traveled, memories of Natasha's bright grin and cheery wave filled his head. He remembered the first time he saw her in the hospital. She was so small and delicate, but she still radiated optimism. Charlie felt completely helpless as his hope faded. He found himself in the hospital's little chapel, which was vacant except for a few flickering candles. Charlie slumped into a pew, head between his hands. He wasn't religious, but he craved for some type of guidance anyway, to make sense of the unfairness of it all. Charlie's resolve grew stronger as he sat in the peaceful chapel. He could not change Natasha's diagnosis, but he could support her and Glory. He would stick by them no matter what occurred. The idea of abandoning them now was inconceivable. Charlie straightened up and wiped his eyes. He had to be strong for them. His mind raced with ideas for how he could help more. Perhaps he might go out to the community and arrange a fundraiser to aid with his growing medical expenses. Perhaps he might arrange for some of Natasha's school classmates to pay her a visit, bringing a sense of normalcy and joy into her hospital room. Charlie took a deep breath and got up, a renewed sense of purpose surging through him. He couldn't change the outcome, but he could make sure Natasha and Glory weren't going through this alone. He headed back toward Natasha's room, his stride steady and resolute. Whatever lay ahead, he would be there, providing unfailing support and love. Charlie returned to the precinct, his thoughts still at the hospital with Natasha and Glory. He collapsed into his chair, staring blankly at the stack of papers on his desk. The words on the reports blended together, useless in light of Natasha's battle. Charlie's companion, Officer Rodriguez, observed his peculiar conduct. "Hey, Blake," he replied, with anxiety in his voice. "You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Charlie blinked, attempting to focus on his coworker. "I'm fine," he murmured, but his tone lacked confidence. Rodriguez was not convinced. He pulled up a chair and sat down next to Charlie. "Come on, man. Something's eating at you. What's going on?" Charlie paused, unsure how to convey the link he had developed with the little girl he hardly knew. However, as he looked around the precinct, he noticed genuine concern on the faces of his fellow policemen. These people were more than simply co-workers. They were his second family. With a long sigh, Charlie began speaking. "There's this little girl, Natasha. She used to wave at me every morning on my patrol route." His voice cracked slightly as he continued. "She's in the hospital now. It's not looking good." The audience grew hushed as Charlie told Natasha's story. He informed them about her daily waves, her relationship with her late father, and her present battle with the rare disease. As he talked, Charlie felt a weight lifted from his shoulders. Officer Chen, a normally composed veteran, wiped a tear from her eye. "That's heartbreaking, Charlie. Is there anything we can do to help?" Charlie looked up, astounded by the outpouring of support. I don't know, I just feel so helpless." Sergeant Thompson, who had been listening quietly, finally piped up. "We're not helpless, Blake. We're a team, and we take care of our own. This little girl is important to you, so she's important to us." Other officers began to share their opinions. Rodriguez proposed holding a fundraiser to aid with medical expenses. Chen advised contacting local media to raise awareness of Natasha's situation. Officer Patel offered to arrange with local businesses to collect donations. Charlie felt hope for the first time in days, as his colleagues rallied around him. He knew he wasn't alone in this battle. With the help of his police family, he may be able to make a significant impact for Natasha and Glory. Charlie's heart was filled with thankfulness as he watched his colleagues brainstorm ideas. Their zeal and kindness moved him greatly. For the first time in days, a ray of hope appeared in his chest. Charlie stood up, full of sudden determination. "I need to speak with the captain," he said. He approached Captain Mike's office, his mind spinning with options. He knocked on the door and heard a harsh, "Come in." Charlie entered, standing strong in front of his superior. "Captain, I have a proposal," he said calmly, despite his concerns. Captain Mike looked up from his paperwork, lifting an eyebrow. "Go on, Blake." Taking a deep breath, Charlie explained Natasha's circumstances and the precinct's willingness to assist. "We'd like to organize a fundraiser, sir, for Natasha's medical bills." The captain listened closely, and his expression softened as Charlie spoke. When Charlie ended, there was a moment of silence that felt endless. Finally, Captain Mike nodded. "Approved, Officer Blake. This department stands behind its community. Let me know what resources you need." Relief flooded over Charlie. "Thank you, sir. This means more than you know." Charlie returned to the bullpen and gave the good news. The room exploded with cheers and applause. Officer Chen immediately began making calls to local businesses. Rodriguez started preparing a press release. The entire precinct was alive with activity. As Charlie watched his teammates rush into action, he felt a warm sensation spread through his chest. This wasn't just about raising funds. It was about showing Natasha and Glory that they weren't alone. Charlie smiled for the first time in days. He pictured Glory's reaction when he told her about the benefit. He imagined Natasha's eyes light up at the knowledge that so many people cared about her. Charlie rejoined his colleagues in their planning efforts, full of new vigor. As they worked late into the night, he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't had in years. This campaign may not cure Natasha, but it may bring some hope into her and Glory's lives during this difficult time. Charlie's step seemed lighter when he left the precinct that night. Tomorrow, he would pay a visit to the hospital with news that could just make Natasha happy. Charlie felt hopeful for the first time since learning about her disease. The next day, Charlie's heart raced as he entered Natasha's hospital room. He stood at the door, took a long breath, and knocked gently. Glory's tired voice beckoned, "Come in." As soon as Charlie walked in, his gaze was drawn to Natasha's petite shape on the bed. She appeared even pallid than before, her chest rising and falling with weak breaths. Glory sat near her daughter and held her hand. Her eyes were shadowed by dark circles. "Charlie," Glory murmured, with a sad smile. "It's good to see you." Charlie pulled up a chair next to Glory. "How is she doing?" he said softly, his gaze never leaving Natasha's. Glory's shoulders sagged. "Not good," she said softly, her voice cracking. "The doctors, they say her condition is getting worse." Charlie's heart tightened with the news. He reached out and put a soothing hand on Glory's shoulder. "I'm so sorry, Glory, but I have some news that may help even if just slightly." Glory gazed up at him, wonder mixed with concern in her eyes. "The entire police department has come together," Charlie said, his voice full of warmth. "We're arranging a fundraiser to help Natasha with her medical expenditures. The entire community is getting involved." Glory was surprised and silent for a moment. Tears welled up in her eyes. "Charlie, too don't know what to say," she began, her voice full with emotion. "You don't have to say anything," Charlie reassured her. "Everyone wants to assist. You and Natasha are not alone in this." Glory's tears overflowed, and she clutched Charlie's hand hard. "Thank you," she muttered. "Thank you so much." As Charlie watched Glory assimilate the news, he noted a subtle shift in her mood. Her shoulders straightened slightly, and a faint spark emerged in her eyes. It was only a glimmer, but it was a ray of hope among the gloom. "Glory," Charlie replied gently, "know things are rough right now. But remember, you have an entire community supporting you. We're all here to help you and Natasha however we can. Glory nodded and wiped her eyes. She stared at Natasha, then back to Charlie. It means more than you know, she added softly. Sometimes it feels like we're fighting this battle alone. But knowing there are people out there who care, it helps. Charlie gripped her hand. Stay strong, Glory. For Natasha, we are all rooting for her and for you. The day of the fundraiser arrived, and Charlie's heart swelled with optimism as he watched people pour into the community hall. The turnout was well beyond his expectations. Officers from his precinct, neighbors, and even strangers from other towns crowded the area, all motivated by a desire to help tiny Natasha. Charlie stood near the entrance, greeting guests with a bright grin and a heartfelt, "Thank you for coming." People donated toys, cuddly animals, and colorful cards for Natasha. Others wrote checks or placed cash in contribution bins. Jim, one of Charlie's fellow policemen, patted him on the back. "You did good, Blake," he remarked, his voice husky with emotion. "Look at all the people. They are here because of you." Charlie shook his head, feeling humble. "No, they're here for Natasha," he said softly. The stories Charlie heard during the day moved him. A young mother approached him while clutching her toddler's hand. "We don't have much," she added, her eyes filled with grief. "But we wanted to help." She gave Charlie a tiny envelope. "It's not a lot, but it's what we could spare." Charlie thanked her, his voice full of emotion. He watched her walk away, recognizing how Natasha's story had touched so many others. The local fire department turned out in full force, bringing a sparkling red truck for the kids to examine. They also presented Charlie with a check, which left him dumbfounded. "We took up a collection," the fire chief explained. "Natasha's one of our own, even if we've never met her." As the afternoon progressed, Charlie was astounded by the community's ingenuity. A local band performed upbeat songs, filling the air with music. Children ran a lemonade stand, proudly stating that all money will benefit Natasha. A group of high school kids planned a bake sale, and their table was stacked high with baked goodies. Charlie's eyes misted over as he surveyed the crowded community center. The show of love and support was tremendous. He thought about Natasha laying in her hospital bed, wishing she could see how many people were rooting for her. As the celebration wound down, Charlie's captain approached him. "Blake," he exclaimed with pride, "I've never seen anything like this. You have brought the entire community together." Charlie nodded, speechless for a moment. He finally found his voice, and it was full of emotion. "I just wanted to help," he explained simply. "I had no idea it would turn into this." His captain gripped his shoulder. "This is what the community is all about, Blake. You have reminded us all of that." The next day, Charlie walked through the antiseptic hospital corridors, his arms full with colorful fundraiser gifts. As he made his way to Natasha's room, the fragrance of disinfection flooded his nostrils, and his heart warmed with the thought of making her smile. But as he reached the corner, he noticed Glory slumped against the wall, her shoulders heaving with quiet sobbing. Charlie's steps faltered, and a sense of dread overcame him. "Glory?" he called gently, picking up his pace. She looked up, her cheeks smeared with tears. "Oh, Charlie," she said softly, her voice breaking. Charlie placed the gifts on a neighboring chair and knelt beside her. "What happened?" he asked, his heart thumping. Glory drew a trembling breath. "Natasha's condition has worsened," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "The doctors, they're running out of options." Charlie felt as if the floor had fallen out from under him. He knew Natasha was severely ill, but hearing these words made it all too real. He tried to think of anything to say that would comfort Glory, but words failed him. "I don't know what to do," Glory said, barely above a whisper. "I feel so helpless." Charlie knew just how he felt. He had been in difficult circumstances as a police officer, but nothing had prepared him for this. He felt completely powerless, unable to safeguard the tiny girl who had become so dear to him. Can I see her?" Charlie inquired, his voice raspy with emotion. Glory nodded and wiped her eyes. "She's been asking for you," she said. I think she sensed something was wrong. Charlie helped Glory to her feet, keeping his hand steady on her arm as they headed toward Natasha's room. He attempted to suppress his own concerns. He needed to be strong for both Glory and Natasha. But as they approached the door, Charlie paused. He was afraid of what he would see off confronting the reality of Natasha's deteriorating condition. He took a deep breath to prepare himself for what lied ahead. That night, Charlie sat by Natasha's bed. The faint beeping of machines filled the calm room. The small girl lay still, her chest rising and falling with faint breaths. Charlie gently placed his larger palm over her small hand, which rested on top of the blanket. Natasha's pale face was accentuated by the gloomy light, which cast shadows across it. Charlie's heart wrenched as he watched her sleep, recalling the bright-eyed girl who used to wave at him from her window. "Hey, kiddo," he muttered, barely audible. "I don't know if you can hear me, but I want you to know something." Charlie paused and swallowed hard against the lump in his throat. He'd been in a lot of unpleasant situations as a cop, but nothing like this. He said, "That wave of yours, it has meant more to me than you would ever know. Every morning, seeing your happy face at the window cheered my day." He gently squeezed Natasha's hand, taking care not to dislodge the foreline. "You've inspired a lot of people, Natasha. You were instrumental in bringing the entire community together. You've changed people's lives in ways you can't conceive." Charlie's voice broke, and tears welled up in his eyes. He blinked hard, hoping to keep them at away, but they spilled over and ran down his cheeks. "I want you to know," he added, his voice full of emotion, "that no matter what happens, I will never stop waving back. Every morning, I will wave as I drive past your house. I promise." The tears poured freely now, landing on the white hospital blanket. Charlie made no effort to wipe them away. He sat there, clutching Natasha's hand, silently vowing to uphold his commitment no matter what happened. Charlie's nightly prayers had become a ritual, his voice barely audible in his flat. Every evening, he kneeled beside his bed, hands held firmly, pleading for a miracle for Natasha. Each impassioned plea rekindled his long-dormant faith. Days turned into weeks. Charlie commuted between work and the hospital, and his patrol car knew the way like it was home. The hospital staff were accustomed to seeing the officer in uniform, his face etched with concern, but his eyes never giving up hope. One morning, as Charlie entered Natasha's room for his daily visit, he discovered something unusual. Glory stood near the bed, her eyes filled with unshed tears. But these weren't the tears of grief he was used to witnessing. There was a gleam of hope. "Charlie," Glory murmured, her voice shaking. "She opened her eyes this morning. The doctors say there is a slight improvement." Charlie's heart raced in his chest. He walked closer to the bed, unable to believe it. Natasha lay, eyes wide but heavy-lidded. Her complexion, while still pale, had a tinge of color that had not been present previously. A doctor entered the room, looking cautiously optimistic. "Officer Blake," he said, nodding in greeting. "As I said to Miss Glory, Natasha's condition has slightly improved. Her vital signs are better, and she's more alert." Charlie listened closely, his hand subconsciously reaching for Natasha's. "Now, I want to be clear," the doctor added, his tone serious. "She's not out of the woods yet, but this is a positive sign, and it gives us hope." Glory and Charlie exchanged glances, both clutching this information like a lifeline. It was more than they had hoped for. In several weeks, as the doctor left, Charlie returned his focus to Natasha. Her gaze met his, and she appeared to be attempting to compose words. "Hey there, kiddo," Charlie whispered quietly, coming in closer. "What is it?" Natasha's lips moved. Her voice was barely a whisper. "I missed waving." Charlie felt his heart contract. Even in her frail state, Natasha was thinking about their particular ritual. He tenderly squeezed her hand and fought back tears. "I've missed it too, sweetheart," he said, his voice full with sorrow. "But don't you worry, we'll have plenty of time for waving once you're better." Natasha's face lit up with a faint but distinct smile. It was the most breathtaking scene Charlie had ever witnessed. Charlie left the hospital that evening with a new feeling of purpose. Natasha's little smile had set off a spark in him, and he was determined to fan it into a flame. As he drove home, a thought began to develop in his head. The following morning, Charlie arrived to the police station earlier than normal. He gathered his other policemen around him, his eyes full of joy. "Listen up, everyone," he urged, his voice full of resolve. "I need your help with something special for Natasha." Charlie's co-workers nodded warmly as he recounted his plans for a wave parade. The word immediately spread throughout the station, and everyone was on board. Charlie used his lunch break to visit local businesses and knock on doors in the neighborhood. He told Natasha's experience and shared his plan for the parade. To his surprise, people's eyes lit up and immediately consented to participate. "Of course, we'll be there," Mrs. Jackson from the bakery spoke, wiping away a tear. "That sweet girl deserves all the love we can give her." Charlie worked tirelessly for several days to organize the event. He worked with the medical staff to ensure Natasha was by the window at the appropriate time. He created beautiful flyers and disseminated them throughout town. His fellow officers helped spread the word, and it appeared like the entire town was abuzz with excitement. The parade day arrived, and Charlie drove to the hospital, his heart racing. He spotted Glory in Natasha's room and told her about the surprise. "Oh, Charlie," Glory said, her palm rushing to her mouth. "This is..." "I'm not sure what to say." Charlie grinned gently. "You don't have to say anything. Let's give Natasha something to smile about." The day of the wave parade began bright and clear, as if the sun wanted to join in the festivities. Charlie arrived at the hospital early, his heart pumping in expectation. He observed, as people began to assemble outside, their faces lit up with hope and joy. Balloons of every color floated in the soft air, while handmade signs with encouraging messages sprinkled the gathering. Charlie recognized familiar faces from the police station, local businesses, and the neighborhood of strangers who had heard Natasha's tale were drawn in by the force of community and compassion. As the allotted time approached, Charlie took his place in front of the throng. He peered up at Natasha's window, knowing that Glory was about to bring her daughter to view the surprise. "Okay, everyone," Charlie exclaimed, his voice strong and clear. "On the count of 3, let us show Natasha how much we care. 1, 2, and 3. With that, a sea of hands ascended into the sky. The audience began to wave, causing a ripple effect that resembled a living, breathing organism of love and solidarity. Cheers and yells of support filled the air, climbing to Natasha's window. Glory gently helped Natasha sit up in her hospital bed. "There's something special for you outside, sweetheart," she whispered quietly, eating the bed closer to the window. As Glory pulled aside the curtains, Natasha's eyes widened in surprise. The image that met her was beyond her wildest imagination. Hundreds of people gathered below, all waving at her window. Colorful balloons floated through the air, and she could make out placards with her name on them. Natasha's face lit up with a real smile, the first time in weeks. Her eyes, which had been darkened by illness and tiredness, now shone with excitement and surprise. She raised her hand weakly and waved at the audience. Glory shed tears of delight as she saw her daughter's reaction. She hadn't seen Natasha grin like this in a long time, and it filled her with optimism. She peered down at the crowd, her gaze drawn to Charlie at the front, who was leading the wave with excitement. Charlie focused his gaze on Natasha's window, and when he noticed her petite hand waving back, his heart soared. He waved even more fiercely, encouraging the mob to keep moving. The vibe was obvious. A physical force of love and support sprang up to hug Natasha and her mother. Charlie felt a lump forming in his throat. He observed her slender hand move back and forth, her smile obvious from a distance. The sight of her feeble but cheerful figure brought tears to his eyes. Charlie couldn't control his feelings any longer. He felt a tear fall down his cheek, but didn't bother wiping it away. Instead, he waved more forcefully, his arm moving with fresh enthusiasm. He wanted Natasha to understand how much she meant to him and to everyone. The crowd around him continued to wave, their excitement building as they observed Natasha's reaction. People shouted and offered words of encouragement. As the wave procession proceeded, their voices joined together to form a chorus of solidarity. Charlie noticed movement in the hospital. Nurses, doctors, and other staff workers began congregating at windows throughout the building. They pressed their faces against the window, watching the events unfold below. Some of them joined in by waving from their positions inside. Even patients in other rooms who could move made their way to the windows, or were assisted by staff to observe the occurrence. The hospital, which is normally a site of quiet concern, was filled with a different type of energy, hope, and community. Charlie noticed an elderly man in a wheelchair, accompanied by a nurse, waving from a nearby window. A small child with a cast stood at another, raising his good arm to join the wave. Charlie was extremely moved by the sight of these strangers standing together in support of Natasha. He returned his attention to Natasha's window, where he saw Glory standing at her daughter's bed. Glory had one arm around Natasha and the other waving to the people below. Even from a distance, Charlie could see Glory's expression of excitement and thanks. The wave procession had grown into something bigger than Charlie could have imagined. It was no longer just about Natasha. It had become a source of solidarity for the entire community. People who had never met Natasha were moved to tears by the outpouring of affection and support. As Charlie kept waving, he felt a sense of wonder rush over him. This small act of kindness, inspired by his wish to make Natasha smile, had impacted so many others. He understood that by attempting to convey hope to one little child, he had unintentionally brought hope to the entire neighborhood. Natasha's health fluctuated throughout time. Some days, she appeared stronger, her smile brighter, and her voice slightly louder. Other days, she lay silently in her hospital bed, exhausted. But through it all, the hope sparked by the community's efforts remained constant, giving Natasha and Glory new courage to face each day. Charlie began to make increasingly frequent visits to the hospital. He would often appear after his shift, still dressed in his uniform, with a new book or a small present for Natasha. He'd sit by her bedside, his strong voice softening, as he read her stories about courageous princesses and kind-hearted heroes. "Officer Charlie," Natasha would say, her eyes lighting up whenever he entered the room. "Will you read me another chapter?" Charlie always obliged, delighted to see the sparkle of happiness in her eyes. He'd take up a chair, clear his throat, and start reading, periodically looking up to watch Natasha's reaction to the story. Glory witnessed these exchanges with gratitude. She watched how Charlie's presence reassured her daughter, and she found herself relying on him for support as well. On difficult days, as Natasha's condition deteriorated, Charlie would sit with Glory in the hospital cafeteria, listening as she expressed her anxieties and hopes. "I don't know what we'd do without you, Charlie," Glory said one evening, holding a cup of lukewarm coffee. Charlie placed a kind hand on her shoulder. "You aren't alone in this, Glory. We're with you both every step of the way." Charlie, Glory, and Natasha became something of a family unit as their friendship got stronger. They helped one another through the ups and downs of Natasha's therapy, drawing strength from their shared experiences. Glory and Natasha would pray together every night after Charlie left and the hospital had quieted down. Natasha's delicate fingers linked with her mother's, and they'd bow their heads together. "Dear God," Glory would begin, her voice calm but firm. "Please watch over Natasha and help her grow stronger each day." Natasha would then offer her own prayer, speaking barely above a whisper. "Thank you to Officer Charlie and everyone who waved to me. Please help me get healthier so that I can wave from my window again." They'd complete their prayer by thanking God for Charlie's and the community's support, and expressing gratitude for the love that surrounded them at this terrible time. As they murmured, "Amen," Glory would kiss Natasha's forehead, and both of them felt a sense of calm sweep over them. Natasha's condition gradually improved over the course of several weeks. The doctors, who had been cautiously optimistic, were astounded by her resilience. They watched with astonishment as her test results improved and her vigor gradually restored. Dr. Jackson walked into Natasha's room one sunny morning, beaming. Glory and Charlie, who had been keeping their normal vigil by Natasha's bedside, glanced up with anticipation. "I have some wonderful news, Doctor," Jackson said. "Natasha's most recent tests indicate substantial progress. Her condition has stabilized, and we are seeing progress that we did not expect." Glory's eyes welled with tears of excitement as she grasped Natasha's hand. Charlie exhaled a deep breath. He hadn't realized he was holding. "Is it really true?" Glory inquired, her voice shaking with hope. Dr. Jackson nodded, his eyes gleaming. "It is true. I would describe it as nothing short of a miracle." Natasha, still fragile, but with life in her eyes, smiled at her mother and Charlie. "Does this mean I can fully stay at home now?" she asked quietly. "We're getting there, sweetheart, Doctor," Jackson said gently. "We need to keep you here a little longer to make sure everything's okay. But if things continue like this, you'll be home before you know it." The news immediately traveled across the hospital and the town. Charlie broke down in tears as he delivered the news. With his fellow officers and the residents who had rallied behind Natasha, the pleasure was evident as individuals hugged one, some crying, some laughing with relief. Natasha's strength gradually increased throughout the course of the following days. She was able to sit up in bed for greater lengths of time, and her appetite gradually returned. Glory and Charlie watched in amazement as the young girl they had dreaded losing bloomed again. After what seemed like an age, Natasha was finally approved to go home. As Charlie helped Glory pack Natasha's belongings, the little girl sat on the side of her bed, swinging her legs happily. "I can't wait to see my room again," Natasha said, her voice stronger than it had been in months. "And my window. I'd like to wave to you from my window again, Officer Charlie." Charlie knelt alongside her, his eyes misting. "I can't wait to watch the wave, youngster. It's the highlight of my day, you know." As they prepared to leave the hospital, nurses and doctors who had cared for Natasha arrived to say their goodbyes, marveling at her recovery. Dr. Jackson cautioned them that, while Natasha was well enough to go home, she still required close monitoring and regular examinations. Natasha's life began to feel more normal as she returned home. The familiar sights and sounds of her bedroom provided solace after a long hospital stay. Her beloved stuffed animals lined the shelves, and the sunlight flowed through her window exactly as she recalled. Natasha woke early the morning after her return. As she climbed out of bed and approached the window, she felt a flutter of excitement in her stomach. It was time for her personal ritual. As the sun rose over the horizon, bathing the sky in delicate pinks and oranges, Natasha noticed Officer Charlie's patrol car round the corner. Her face brightened up with a big smile as she raised her hand and waved vigorously. Charlie's heart filled with excitement when he saw the little girl at her window again. He waved back, his eyes misting with passion. This simple act, which had become so important to both of them, seemed even more precious today. But today was different. As Charlie walked down the block, he spotted Mrs. Thompson from next door stroll out onto her porch. She looked up at Natasha's window and waved cheerfully. Natasha giggled and waved in response, shocked by the unexpected greeting. Natasha's return had rapidly become public knowledge, and the community wanted to show their support. Throughout the day, more neighbors stopped by Natasha's house. Each stopped to peek up at her window and wave. Some even offered words of encouragement. "Welcome home, Natasha. Mr. Garcia shouted while walking his dog. We missed you, sweetheart. Mrs. Lee said, blowing a kiss. Natasha's eyes widened in surprise. She hadn't known how many people cared about her. With each wave and sweet phrase, she felt stronger and more loved. Glory stared from the doorway, her heart full of thanks. She noticed how each kind face brightened Natasha's mood, restoring color to her cheeks and a sparkle to her eyes. As time passed, Natasha's window became a beacon of optimism for the entire neighborhood. People went out of their way to visit her residence, hoping to participate in the joy of her recovery. Some brought flowers or small presents and left them on the porch with encouraging comments. Natasha's wave, which began as a private moment between her and Officer Charlie, has evolved into a symbol of community spirit and resilience. The little girl who had captivated so many hearts was now surrounded by a circle of love and support that extended well beyond her window. As the days stretched into weeks, Charlie's visits to Natasha's house became a beloved ritual. He would swing by after his shift, frequently bringing tiny gifts or sweets that made Natasha's eyes light up with delight. The closeness between them strengthened with each passing day. Charlie arrived home on a lovely afternoon to find Glory in the kitchen preparing dinner. She gave him a loving smile, the kind reserved for close friends and relatives. Charlie, you're just in time, Glory said, while stirring a soup on the stove. I'm making Natasha's favorite soup. Do you want to stay for dinner? Charlie's heart soared at the invitation. I'd love to, he said, hanging up his hat. Charlie and Glory struck up a casual discussion while working together in the kitchen. They discussed Natasha's development, shared stories from the day, and laughed at one another's jokes. It seemed natural, as if they had known each other for years. Natasha sat on the couch, coloring in a book provided to her by Charlie. As Charlie walked in, she glanced up and smiled widely. Officer Charlie, she shouted, rushing up to hug him. Look what I drew for you. Charlie knelt to examine the vivid artwork. It featured 3 stick figures holding hands. A tall one wearing a police hat, a medium-sized one with curly hair, and a small one with pigtails. Is this us? Charlie inquired, his voice filled with emotion. Natasha nodded excitedly. You, me, and Mommy, we're a family now. Charlie felt tears prick his eyes. He looked up and saw Glory watching them, her eyes gleaming. As they sat down to eat, the atmosphere was warm and inviting. Charlie helped Natasha chop her meal as a parent would. They laughed, told stories, and made new memories together. Natasha tugged on Charlie's sleeve as he prepared to depart after supper. Officer Charlie, she whispered softly. You know what? You are like my protective angel. You've always been there for me, even when I was very sick. Charlie knelt to Natasha's level, greatly moved by her remarks. Oh, Natasha, he replied, his voice heavy with passion. You, too, are my guardian angel. You have brought so much joy into my life. He hugged her closely, sensing the love and connection that had developed between them. As he rose up, he noticed Glory watching them, her eyes full of thanks and adoration. Natasha's health gradually improved as summer flowered in the neighborhood. Her cheeks regained their rosy tint, and her laughter filled the home once more. The community, moved by her story and inspired by her fortitude, decided to hold a party in her honor. The local park has been converted into a holiday wonderland. Colorful balloons floated in the mild air, and hand-painted banners read, "Welcome back, Ash." Families gathered, bringing potluck dishes and kind smiles. The air was filled with excitement and delight. Charlie stood in the middle of it all, feeling slightly uncomfortable in his formal uniform. He'd been invited as the guest of honor, which humbled and overwhelmed him. When he saw Natasha running around with her pals, her pigtails bouncing with each step, he felt a lump grow in his throat. Glory approached him, her eyes full of gratitude. It's time for your speech, Charlie, she whispered quietly, squeezing his arm. Everyone's waiting." Charlie nodded and took a deep breath as he approached the little podium put up near the park's gazebo. The crowd's banter hushed down as he cleared his throat, and all eyes focused on him. "I'm not much for public speaking," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "But for Natasha, I do just about anything." A ripple of laughter went across the audience, calming his anxiety. "Many of you know me as Officer Blake, the guy who patrols your streets. But thanks to a little girl's wave, I became so much more." Charlie's gaze spotted Natasha in the crowd, and she smiled at him. Every morning, Natasha would be at her window, waving as I drove past. It was such a little gesture, but it made my day in ways I can't describe. Charlie paused and swallowed hard. What I didn't know then was how much that simple act would change my life. He went on to explain how Natasha's wave had become a connection to her late father, forming a tie that helped them both during her illness. Charlie's voice cracked as he described the bleak days in the hospital, and the hope that grew with each minor improvement. "Natasha taught me that even the smallest gestures can have the greatest impact," Charlie explained, his eyes watering over. "Her wave wasn't simply a greeting. It was an offer to become a part of something larger than myself. It served as a reminder that we are all connected and capable of making a meaningful difference in one another's lives." As the weeks passed, life in the neighborhood fell into a new rhythm. The summer heat gave way to the chilly fall air, which painted the trees in beautiful shades of scarlet and gold. Every morning, Charlie's patrol car would round the corner onto Natasha's street, his heart racing with expectation. On this particular morning, the sun had just begun to rise above the horizon, sending a pleasant glow over the quiet cottages. Charlie slowed his car as he reached Natasha's house, his gaze naturally drawn to her window. There she stood, tall and strong, her sparkling eyes gleaming with excitement. Natasha put her small hand against the window, gesturing enthusiastically. This modest gesture, which was previously an everyday occurrence, now held the weight of their common journey. It was a monument to her survival, a beacon of hope that had led them through the most difficult days. Charlie's throat tightened as he raised his hand to wave back. Tears welled in his eyes, temporarily distorting his vision. He blinked tears away, not wanting to miss a second of this exquisite moment. This wave was more than simply a greeting. It was a celebration of life, tenacity, and the strong tie they'd formed. Charlie's thoughts turned to the long nights in the hospital, the terror and uncertainty that had held them all. He recalled the community pulling together, the parade of support, and the numerous tiny gestures of kindness that had lifted their spirits. All of it had led to this moment, Natasha, healthy and happy, carrying on their particular ritual. Charlie's heart flooded with love he'd never experienced before. This tiny girl had taught him more about compassion and connection than he had learnt in his whole career on the force. She had taught him the genuine value of community, family, and unshakable hope in the face of adversity. Charlie knew as he drove away that this moment would be with him for the rest of his life. The image of Natasha at her window, waving with excitement and vigor, would stay with him. It was a reminder of the power of human connection, and how even the tiniest acts might have huge consequences. If you enjoyed the story of Officer Blake and Natasha, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this. Click here to watch it.